36 years ago, in the blazing summer of 1941, the region of eastern Galicia, then Polish, now Soviet territory, was stunned by an appalling massacre. Over a period of a few weeks, something like 800 men, women, young children, Jews and known communists were cut down by Tommy guns and their bodies heaped into mass graves. It was another Nazi war crime, the sort of crime that's burnt deep into the bitter folk memory of Eastern Europe. Tonight, the richest man in Holland is held behind the walls of this Dutch prison, accused of being responsible for those killings. The charge is that as a Nazi officer, Peter Menton settled old scores by murder and built up his vast fortune by looting art treasures from rich Jews. Soon, the court trying Menton is expected to travel to Russia to witness the opening of another mass grave, holding, it's alleged, more of Menton's victims. As well as the trial, a special commission set up by the government after heavy pressure is investigating whether Menton bought protection from prosecution. The issue that's making Dutch headlines now is what the trial shows about the real history of Holland in the war and the years after. Hans Knoop, the editor of the Dutch magazine Accent, is without doubt the man who put Peter Menton on trial. From obscurity, he's become a journalist who on one hand is famous, admired and praised, and incidentally extremely well off, having picked up a $10,000 reward for tracing Menton. On the other, he's feared, despised and dismissed as a cheap opportunist. Today, a public holiday in Holland, he's once again the only man in the office, hammering out his latest indictment. A re-examination of the whole of Holland's record under Nazi occupation. If Knoop is right, the story of Peter Menton is disturbing and still almost incredible. For years, Menton lived as a respected figure, mixing freely with Holland's richest and most powerful families. At 78, he was a multimillionaire with one of the finest art collections in Europe. It was accepted that he had collaborated with the Nazis as an interpreter, an offence for which he served 8 months in prison, and that some of his paintings were Polish. He seemed open about his past and always welcomed journalists to his mansion, among them Hans Knoop.
It's a mansion, a 50-room mansion with an enormous garden, an Olympic-size swimming pool. It's treasure, wherever you look, paintings, and very, very expensive paintings. He has almost the entire collection of the Polish Rembrandt, that's how they call him, Gottlieb, a Jewish painter. All the Dutch classics are hanging there, and also Italian masters. The house is more or less a museum. It's something out of this world. You wouldn't believe your eyes. I've never seen such an enormous amount of art treasures together, stored in one mansion. It's something extraordinary.
Knoop was among a handful of people in Holland who had grave doubts about how Menton came by his priceless paintings and antiques.
Menton left Poland in 1943, so just in the middle of the war, from Krakow in Poland, and returned to Holland. And got permission from the SS, from Himmler personally, to take all his art with him in 3 railway vans. So just imagine that this man got permission in the middle of the war to travel by train from Krakow to Holland through occupied Europe with 3 train wagon vans full of art.
About a year ago, Menton decided to auction some of his paintings at Sotheby's in Amsterdam. Demonstrators turned up to accuse him of being a Nazi thief, and that publicity jogged the memories of exiled Jews, memories of a Nazi officer called Peter Menton. Hans Knoop decided he was onto something and called on Menton again.
During the encounter in his Blaricum mansion, he offered me a $10,000 bribe sum if I would drop the story, which I, of course, refused.
For a time, Menton kept up his confident profile, but as the journalistic delving went on, his composure started to suffer.
During the weekend, he continued phoning me all the time, and, well, his tone, of course, changed. He was no longer polite. He started to threaten me. He started to impress me with his enormous wealth. He was threatening me that he would buy my magazine overnight. He could easily buy all the shares overnight, and that I would then be in his service and would be fired.
There was no doubt that Menton did have powerful friends as well as money. At his trial immediately after the war for collaboration, while others were being sent away for up to 10 years, he inexplicably received a sentence of only a few months. The more the allegations of wartime murders mounted, the more Menton brushed them aside and went on Dutch television to do it.
Wat moet je daar nou op zeggen?
These charges are trumped up. They're accusations without a shred of proof. The Germans didn't need any help from me in shooting people. Every time some psychopath makes an allegation, why should I spend my time denying it? And the dirtiest trick of all is that if a charge like this is made, they should say where it happened, on which day, in which month, in which year. And they don't.
The precise date and time of a massacre allegedly ordered by Menton came from a witness tracked down in Stockholm. His name, Michael Hauptmann. The date fixed in his mind, August the 27th, 1941.
I can still see Menton in the uniform of an SS man, wearing that special cap they had. That memory is going to stay with me a long time.
At village parties, he claims, Menton would dance with the Hauptmann daughters. He says that one Hauptmann girl, who'd managed to get American citizenship, pleaded with Menton to respect the new nationality of her little girl and herself.
He gave my sister the Nazi salute. She showed him her American citizenship papers. He looked, then stood to attention and said my sister should step aside. When she turned round with her little daughter, he made a sign to another SS man, who turned round and shot both of them with his machine gun.
In the summer of last year, the Russians allowed Dutch journalists into eastern Galicia to the sites of the alleged Menton atrocities. The version they heard from the villagers went something like this. In the 1920s, Menton was a prosperous businessman living in what was then Poland and on good terms with wealthy local Jews. But just before the war, eastern Galicia was taken over by the Russians. Menton lost his estates and moved into German territory to become a Nazi. When the Nazis swept eastwards, Menton found himself back on his old ground with its alleged scores to settle. Today, the villagers claim that Menton ordered mass shootings of Jews because of old business grudges and of communists for taking over what was once his land.
How could these witnesses, though, be certain after all these years that it was Menton who was responsible?
First of all, I want to stress that personally I never used the name Menton. I didn't want to push this name. But all of them spontaneously said the one who ordered this execution and who was physically present there was Peter, or they call him Petro Menton. In the second place, I took with me a set of photographs of different people. One of them was Menton, and I showed them these pictures, and all of them picked out Menton's picture, saying, this is him, Menton, Petro Menton.
Petro Menton.
Petro Menton?
Petro Menton. Petro Menton.
Menton.
Dat is Menton.
Вы точно это знаете?
Menton. Zeker? Ja, dat is Menton. Dat is Menton, zeker.
Menton. Menton.
The Russian authorities ordered that the mass graves should be reopened and the remains examined.
Bones were laying all around the garden. Skulls were being washed by Soviet soldiers. Doctors were doing examination on the bones. It was something indescribable. I really can't go into detail because it was something extraordinary. I've never seen such a thing before. We saw many skulls of small children of about 7 or 8 years old. Well, horrible things. Horrible.
Another eyewitness was traced, this time to New York. Abe Polak, who came from the same area, emigrated to America. He claims to have seen another murder ordered by Menton.
They were holding their hands up and to God and to ask him why, and everybody was telling the last word in Hebrew, like they say in Hebrew, Shema Yisrael. Why he did it to them? And a man like this should be still alive. I'm really very surprised.
Did you see Menton's face?
I see Menton's face in a SS uniform. I feel this didn't happen 35 years ago. This happened now, maybe a year when I lost my whole family.
As the allegations mounted, Menton did agree to take one last call from a journalist.
Nooit! Al die flauwekul van een boswachter. Het zijn allemaal analfabeten daar. Die mensen kunnen niet eens schrijven of lezen.
He insisted then, and still does, that the whole story is a Russian plot,
Maar niet omgekeerd. U is een landverrader.
and that some of the reporters involved are agents of the KGB.
Goedenavond.
After months of journalistic pressure, the Dutch police decided to act, but too late.
On November 15, 10 o'clock in the morning, Menton should be arrested, and when police forces entered his house, he was already gone, and he left the previous night.
The suggestion, of course, is that he must have been tipped off by somebody.
Well, this is obvious. Even the Dutch Minister of Justice agreed that this must have been the case.
With plenty of money and his wife, Menton was driving in an anonymous-looking car to Switzerland, under whose special laws he imagined he couldn't be extradited. Peter Menton, millionaire, was prepared to settle for a modest hotel 20 miles from Zurich. Registered under the name Nicholas Menton, an Irish tourist, in room 703. But his sanctuary here in Switzerland lasted only a matter of days, because Hans Knoop had put out the word to literally hundreds of journalistic contacts all over Europe to be on the lookout. And in no time at all, the message came from this small town of Uster. We know where he is. Within hours, Hans Knoop was at the hotel with Dutch and Swiss detectives.
When I saw the elevator coming down, I went to this spot, and when the door opened, I made that move in order to come as close to Menton as possible. I wanted to see his face. And when he recognized me, he immediately started to shout anti-Semitic remarks. He was shouting dirty Jew and dirty communist, and he continued shouting until he entered the police station. During interrogation, he asked if he could use the toilet. Of course he could, and in the toilet he took an enormous number of sleeping pills. And when he didn't return after 10 minutes, the police smashed the door, and by then he was already unconscious. So he was being transferred with an ambulance to the hospital section of Zurich prison. He got hospitalized for 2 days. After 2 days, he was being transferred to Zurich to prison again.
Even then, it was by no means certain that the Swiss would return Menton to Holland. So Knoop, with his instinct for sensationalism, called a press conference at the Zurich hotel to put pressure on the Swiss government. His tramp card was flown in from Israel, Haviv Kanan, a man who remembered Menton from Poland and whose own allegations against Menton had been dismissed by the Dutch authorities years before.
He gave an order to surround all the Jewish families, to bring them to what was the former estate of my uncle, and a grave was there prepared and a wooden board placed over the grave.
Knoop's audacity worked. Holland's Minister of Justice felt obliged to fly to Zurich himself, and finally the Swiss cabinet agreed to extradite Menton to Holland, providing he wasn't handed over to any other country. Menton then soon found himself on board a private jet, heading home to face one of Holland's biggest ever trials. The setting is here, in an antiseptic-looking courthouse in Amsterdam. At 9 every morning, Menton's driven under police escort into the guarded underground car park of the court. Inside, Menton's story is unchanging. The whole thing is a web of KGB lies, forged papers, a conspiracy between envious Jews and the Kremlin to destroy him. His wife, needless to say, tells the same story. From all over the world, prosecution witnesses have been brought to Holland to give their versions of the Peter Menton they knew 30 years ago in Poland. From New York, Abe Polak and his wife, so anxious that they had to be booked into an obscure hotel under assumed names. Anxious, too, about the memories that might be brought back by facing Menton across the courtroom.
When we were first married, he would dream about it, have nightmares, get up screaming, cursing, crying. But with time, it has eased a little. He told me the story, laughing and crying while he told me. And that was the most of it. You can't live with the past 24 hours a day.
From Israel, Haviv Kanan, whose claim that members of his family were massacred touched the first spark of the Menton affair.
He was facing me stubbornly, arrogantly, and I looked at him, and the whole audience was watching how we are facing each other and in having to listen to the brutal outbursts of the accused, who sometimes appearing in my eyes as a commander of an Einsatzkommando. He's not talking, just shouting vulgarly and brutally.
Hans Knoop, of course, was there as well. For him, this was the beginning of the end of the first part of the story.
This face-to-face confrontation has been the most shocking experience I've ever had.
Do you mind very much now what the outcome in it, or is it enough for you simply to see him accused?
No, it's not enough, of course. I want him to be condemned. I don't care about the sentence, even if he will have a very light sentence because of his age. I will not be disappointed because I'm not seeking revenge. The only thing which I think is absolutely necessary is that this man will go into Dutch history as a war criminal, and therefore, of course, he needs to be sentenced.
But after the courtroom has been cleared each night, there remains a whiff of much broader issues raised by the Menton trial. The suggestion of massive political protection for Menton since the end of the war. Whispers of involvement with senior Dutch officials. In Parliament, Justice Minister Van Acht finally agreed under great pressure to a formal inquiry into Menton's past. It's bound to touch on some raw nerves. Did Menton bribe his way out of trouble at his post-war trial? Did he buy protection from other powerful Nazi collaborators in Holland? And how widespread was collaboration across the whole country? Hans Knoop's view, and it's shared by many historians, is that it's time for Holland to re-examine its war history. He claims that the story of how Menton was able to enjoy 30 years of protection began in 1940 on the streets of Amsterdam, which, like other Dutch cities, had thousands of collaborators.
Because Menton disturbs the picture of Holland, which we would like to be the real picture, but which is unfortunately a false picture. Holland is by no means that courageous country that fought against the Germans between 1940 and 1945, as we teach our children. This is absolutely untrue. About 140,000 Jews were living in pre-war Holland, of which only 8,000 returned after the war. In no country, not even in Poland, such a big percentage of Jews has been killed and deported, as has been the case in Holland. I'll give you another figure, another example. The Dutch contingent, which served in the ranks of the voluntary SS, relatively speaking, has been the biggest out of all occupied Europe.
Holland certainly did have its share of leading collaborators who proclaimed Nazi ideals.
Moet iets gedaan worden. De tijd van afwachten is voorbij. De Duitse Wehrmacht.
I know that Holland is the country abroad which has a reputation of being the country of Anne Frank, which has a reputation of the country which saved the lives of so many Jews. Where are these Jews?
The Jews of pre-war Amsterdam, about 12% of the city's population, lived in an isolated Jewish quarter. When the Germans arrived, Jewish shops were branded. Jewish families were registered and forced to wear the Star of David. In 1941, while Menton was on Nazi business elsewhere in Europe, Hans Knup's parents looked out of the window of their third-floor flat on the edge of the Jewish quarter and saw that the Germans were starting to block the canal bridge and to seal off the whole area. Within a few hours, a Jewish ghetto had been created.
So this meant that you were actually a prisoner from that moment. So my father decided to run out of the house immediately. He put off his yellow star, the David star, which Jews were obliged to wear on their shirts, and picked some flowers from the table, took my mother and ran away and crossed the roadblocks which were being laid there. And the Germans, for one reason or another, didn't want to stop them. They got the impression that they were non-Jews. Basically, the deportation of the Jews from Holland was a Dutch matter. It was being done by Dutch police officers who got help in Amsterdam from their colleagues from The Hague, where far less Jews were living. So when they had completed their jobs in The Hague, volunteers from the police from The Hague moved to Amsterdam to assist their Amsterdam colleagues. They were being brought from their houses to a theater in the center of the Jewish quarter, and from there on they were being brought by train to Westerbork.
This former theatre in the heart of the old Jewish quarter was the assembly point for Jews to be counted, checked, then sent off to a special camp for Dutch Jews at Westerbork, northern Holland.
Westerbork is a very small village, and it was not connected with the Dutch railway system. There was no station, no railway station, there was no train going to Westerbork. But the Dutch railway, efficient as it used to be, and probably still is, finally decided that they should extend the rail until Westerbork itself. If you go there, you see that the only thing left there is a buffer on the rail, because it indicates the end of the road. If one was being brought to Westerbork, it meant the end of the road. From there on, the only thing left was the death camps. All the Jews who were being brought to Westerbork, or most of them, 99%, finally ended in either in Auschwitz or in one of these other concentration camps, death camps. The only thing we know is that in Westerbork, which was a transit camp, it was not a concentration camp, no atrocities were being conducted in Westerbork. On the contrary, the atmosphere in Westerbork was very good. It was one of the orders of the German commander of Westerbork to keep the morale as high as possible, because people shouldn't know what was going to happen to them, because they were still in contact with the relatives outside the camp, still living in Amsterdam. So letters had to be written to the relatives that the situation in the camp was very good. They were having even a cabaret on Saturday afternoon. You should realize that many Jews from Germany who escaped from Germany before the war were also in this camp. Many of them were artists, very well-known artists, so they had performances every week. It was not a paradise, of course, but not to be compared with the situation in these camps where they finally had to go.
Most Jews didn't spend long in Westerbork. There were more sinister camps waiting for them elsewhere.
These were Dutch trains, manned with Dutch personnel. From Westerbork, twice a week, trains left for Poland, for the concentration camps. Once again, manned with Dutch personnel. The whole job, the whole bloody job, was a complete Dutch job. No German officer went to a Jewish house to get them out of their houses. This was all done by Dutchmen. Orders were given by Germans. The work itself was done purely by Dutch people.
Knip's charge is that most Dutch were too busy coming to terms with the occupation to bother about the Jews. He insists that he's merely repeating what other Dutch historians have already said.
No more than 15,000, 1-5, people were actively involved in any kind of resistance activity. I mean, sabotage or fighting the Germans. I don't mention these people who threw a leaflet in the mailbox of a neighbor and afterwards, after the war, called themselves a resistance fighter. The active resistance was no more than 15,000 people. The big majority, 90% of the Dutch, was neither involved in pro-German or anti-German activities. They just wanted to live a quiet life.
So, in 1943, with the war still on, Peter Menton had no fears about returning to the quiet Dutch countryside with his priceless collection allegedly pillaged in Poland. On what he thought was perfectly safe ground, he bought a house in a prosperous village near Haarlem and prepared to settle down. If you wanted to buy this place today, it would probably cost you up to £250,000. But even in those days, in the 40s, that sort of figure didn't really bother Menton, because the valuables he'd acquired, one way or another, were worth so much that the first thing he did was to have certain modifications made. The main one was a cleverly hidden secret cellar with an entrance in the living room and stretching away under the main entrance hall. Menton packed every inch of it with paintings, tapestries and silver. At least one member of the resistance movement did discover Menton's secret. As soon as peace came, the man had returned to his job as a senior police officer and, understandably, arrested Menton.
He was coming from Poland by a special train, German train, from Krakow to Haarlem, through the whole of Europe. Loaded full of with objects of art. Full. Later on, in wartime, I received 4 photographs from Menton in the uniform of SS. And that was for us enough to put him on a list of persons who has to be arrested.
The contents of the cellar and other hiding places in the house gave Menton particular power. At that time, paper money had become almost worthless, but with art treasures it was possible for Menton to surround himself with influential friends. Dr. Louis Kortenhorst was the man Menton chose to defend him when he faced collaboration charges in 1949. Kortenhorst was a top politician in the Catholic Party at the time, and the then Minister of Justice was also a member of the same party. Knoop claims that Menton paid 200,000 guilders to Kortenhorst as a contribution to party funds. How worried do you think older politicians, particularly of the Catholic Party that you've mentioned, are now worried about this whole thing being raked up again? Or is it something they would simply rather forget?
Well, first of all, because they don't want to see the history of Holland being rewritten, but especially because they know that if the history of Holland is going to be rewritten, the Catholic role will be probably the dirtiest, because I already said the Protestants, in generally speaking, have a very good war past. Most of the Jews who returned after the war were saved by Protestants. In the southern part of Holland, so the Catholic part, no Jew survived.
The pre-trial judge in that case was Frans Röhrling. He now says that Kortenhorst made unethical approaches to him before the trial had even started, blatantly using his political power to try to frighten a young judge into line.
Mr. Kortenhorst, who was a very important politician and the president of the House of Commons, had a great influence on the Minister of Justice. all Catholics like Menton.
But how do you think it was that Menton was able to exercise this influence on powerful people?
That I don't know. Perhaps he bribed them.
Soon after the trial opened, the Catholic Minister of Justice stunned his own prosecutor by ordering him to get the court to drop the case. In fact, the attempt failed, but things still seemed to go in favour of Menton.
Everyone in the higher government classes believed that Menton was innocent. We, of the resistance, of the interior forces, of the police, of the justice, we believed all that he was guilty. Then you can say, in my position, for instance, how is it possible that higher classes said he's innocent? Why? And don't forget, in the official dossier that is used in the courts, in the trial after the war, several papers, photographs, the 4 photographs we got in wartime are stolen out of the dossier. But that was unbelievable. It was unbelievable.
Peter van Eysendorm, as prosecuting police officer with evidence against Menton, sensed that he was up against a powerful and protective establishment. Was it your impression they simply wanted to push the evidence to one side and not hear it?
Yeah.
Detailed and damning charges about Menton's war history from both Israel and Poland were inexplicably dismissed by the Dutch Ministry of Justice. Menton himself turned his attention to discrediting Judge Roerling and police officer Eysendorm.
Every man who's crossing his path, more or less against him, he is attacked by Menton, and he's a liar, he's a deceiver. Everyone.
Now, Menton himself has called you a forger of documents.
Yes.
And one of the most sinister people employed by the Justice Department. How did you feel when he said that?
Well, it's Menton who says it. So I feel. So I felt. It is Menton who says it.
But it must have made you angry.
Of course it did.
Do you think many people have suffered because they've stood up to Menton and that he's used his influence?
Oh, yes. Several. Yes.
For example?
One of them is Mr. Roerling. It's just a fact that his career as justice authority is broken down.
How would you say that you suffered personally as a result of refusing to cooperate with Menton and his lawyers?
Yes, because of the accusations, of what they said about me. I'm an honest man.
What did they say about you?
That I had committed perjury and falsifications. Never in my life. I was a judge. Therefore, I suffered.
Would you say you suffered in a professional sense, or was it simply political pressure on you?
Political pressure, too, from the side of the Catholic Party.
Today, Peter Menton is at last without powerful friends. At 78 and suffering from diabetes, he may never live to find out whether he's convicted of 2 major massacres. But whether he lives or dies, other disturbing questions still hang in the air. Who really did protect him? Who tipped him off about his impending arrest? And is Hans Knoop right that Holland should take a fresh look at its own war record? Do you think there are people still alive in Holland today, although they're getting older now, who may be afraid that if this Menton inquiry goes on, that something against them will be discovered?
I think so. A lot of them are dead, but they are still alive. Yes, I think so.
I said he's very rich. And in that 30 years, he has done many things with money. I believe that. Sure.
There are more Peter Mentons in Holland, although the others are not as rich as Peter Menton. But I think that Peter Menton is not the only one who managed to get out of the claws of justice for such a long time. I think there are many more people with dirty pasts who are still living a comfortable life in Holland.
Now, you started out on this story strictly as a journalist looking for Menton. Are you now carrying on this campaign more as a Jew than as a journalist?
I must admit, and I do it frankly, I don't have to hide that feeling, that Menton has become a little bit of an obsession for me. I have been working for 13 months on this matter, and I don't think that I would have been so much involved if I wouldn't have been Jewish myself. It's always a difference if you are covering such a thing just from a journalistic point of view, or if you are covering such a thing with the knowledge that you could have been one of his victims.
The victims of those massacres 36 years ago in Eastern Europe have largely been respectfully reburied. It depends on which view you take. The prevailing one in present-day liberal, free-thinking Holland is that it was all a long time ago and that memories of the war should be buried with them. Hans Knoop, whether you agree with him or not, is determined to see that Holland does not forget that easily.